On a calm Thursday morning in Malibu, the sun was shining brightly and the air felt fresh with a soft breeze. The restaurant, tucked away from the busy streets, had a reputation for keeping things private. It wasn't just any place to eat. It was a hidden gem, known for its quiet ambience and upscale meals. People who wanted peace and privacy chose this spot, away from the public eye. Famous faces and business leaders often found their way here, ensuring that no one would bother them. That day, however, the restaurant received an unexpected phone call. It was a last-minute reservation under two different names, which wasn't unusual for the high-end establishment. What was unusual was the level of secrecy that came with it. Only a select few were told about the true identity of the guests. The head chef and one of the most trusted waiters were quietly informed that two of the world's wealthiest tech leaders, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, would be dining there that afternoon. Neither of them made a big scene about their arrival. Jeff was the first to show up, just before noon. He arrived alone, dressed casually in a navy blue polo shirt and sunglasses. He didn't have the kind of appearance that screamed billionaire. He was calm and unassuming as he stepped into the restaurant, glancing around before heading to the back corner where he would sit in peace. He wasn't there to attract attention. He simply wanted to enjoy his lunch. Only minutes later, Mark entered. He was dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, looking like anyone you'd see walking down the street. There was no special treatment, no bodyguards, just a man quietly arriving for a meal. He didn't seem eager to draw attention either. With a small nod, he greeted Jeff, who had already settled into his seat. The two didn't shake hands or exchange pleasantries in the typical way you'd expect two famous business leaders to do. It was as if they were just two old friends meeting for a quiet conversation. The waiter, who had been told to be discreet, quietly guided Mark to the table, a small smile on his face. It was a strange moment, seeing these two powerful men sitting in such an ordinary setting. There were no grand speeches, no flashy entrances. The two billionaires simply settled in, ready to have a conversation. As the waiter handed them menus, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. He knew these men were major players in the world of technology, but he also knew that this lunch would be different from the usual customer interactions. There would be no small talk, no polite exchanges about the weather. Instead, there was the possibility of something much more intriguing happening. Whatever was about to unfold over the next 2 hours, the waiter knew it was something most people could only imagine. As Jeff and Mark settled into their seats, the stage was set for an unexpected meeting between two of the most influential figures in modern history. The waiter could only guess what they would talk about, but he was certain of one thing: it was going to be a conversation no one else would hear. It was a quiet, peaceful afternoon when Jeff Bezos arrived at the restaurant. The air was fresh, and the sound of waves crashing against the beach could be heard in the distance. Malibu was known for its relaxed vibe, and the restaurant, hidden away from the busy streets, was the perfect spot for someone who wanted to stay out of the spotlight. Jeff didn't make a big show of his arrival. He parked his sleek black car and stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses as he glanced around. His casual outfit, a simple blue polo shirt and khaki pants, didn't scream billionaire. He looked like any other person who might enjoy a quiet meal at a beachside restaurant. There were no flashy gestures, no crowds following him. Just a calm, quiet entrance. The waiter who had been assigned to him quickly noticed the man walking in. He didn't need any introduction. He immediately recognized Jeff Bezos. Despite his fame, Jeff moved with a sense of calm, never drawing unnecessary attention. He walked into the restaurant like any other customer, greeted by the manager, and led straight to the back corner table that had been prepared for him. It was a perfect spot, away from the front of the restaurant, tucked behind a row of plants where he wouldn't be disturbed. Jeff sat down, his expression neutral but relaxed. He wasn't here to work or to answer questions. He was here to enjoy a meal in peace. As he looked at the menu, the waiter couldn't help but wonder what kind of conversation would take place that day. After all, Jeff Bezos wasn't just any businessman. He was one of the richest and most powerful people in the world. Only a few minutes later, Mark Zuckerberg walked into the restaurant. He wasn't alone, but his arrival seemed just as low-key as Jeff's. Mark wore a simple gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, nothing that would stand out. He didn't look like the man behind one of the biggest social media platforms in the world. He was just another person, strolling into the restaurant like it was an ordinary day. Mark glanced around briefly before making his way toward the table where Jeff was sitting. The waiter, who had been expecting Mark, stepped forward and quietly guided him to the same back corner. There was no fanfare, no large crowd, just two of the most powerful people in the tech world sitting down to enjoy a meal in private. When Mark sat down, he exchanged a quick nod with Jeff, acknowledging each other without any words. It wasn't a grand greeting. It wasn't anything special. Just a simple moment between two people who had plenty to discuss, but didn't need to announce it to the world. The waiter couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This wasn't going to be just any regular lunch. He knew these two men were famous for shaping the world with their businesses, and now, here they were, sitting down as if they were just two old friends catching up. The conversation that would unfold in the next couple of hours would be something that no one else would hear, and the waiter could only imagine what might be said. As Jeff and Mark settled into their seats, the stage was set for a private meeting between two giants of the tech industry. What would they talk about? Only time would tell. As the waiter set down 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table, the room around Jeff and Mark remained calm and quiet. The two tech leaders exchanged brief smiles before shifting their attention to the menus in front of them. It was a simple moment, but in that small, quiet space, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The waiter, who had been trained to remain professional and respectful, carefully watched as the two men began their meal. But it wasn't the food that caught his attention, it was their conversation. From the very first words that Jeff spoke, it was clear that this lunch would be far from ordinary. Jeff glanced up from the menu and asked, almost casually, "Do you ever regret building something this big?" His voice was calm, without the sharpness of a businessman trying to make a point, but it was clear that he was asking a serious question. Mark, who had been quietly reading through his menu, paused. He looked up, meeting Jeff's gaze. There was no sign of tension between them, just two people who understood each other's world in ways that most couldn't. Mark leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before answering. "Sometimes," Mark said slowly, "but then I remind myself, it's better to shape the world than let others shape it for you." His words hung in the air for a moment, and the waiter, who was now standing off to the side, couldn't help but overhear. It wasn't a conversation about profits or numbers, but about something deeper, the weight of building something so powerful and the responsibility that came with it. Jeff nodded thoughtfully. He took a sip of water before replying. "You're right. We've created things that affect millions of lives, sometimes in ways we didn't predict." There was a quiet honesty in his voice, a rare glimpse into the mind of the man who had built Amazon from the ground up. But at what cost? Are we really in control, or have we become slaves to the systems we created? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a small bite of his food, letting Jeff's words sink in. The waiter had never heard anything like this before. The two men were discussing not just their businesses, but the very nature of the world they had shaped. It was as though they were questioning the very foundations of the tech industry itself. Mark finally broke the silence. "I think about that too," he said. "Meta has become something bigger than I ever imagined, but I've learned to let go of some of the control. You can't control everything." His voice was soft but firm, as if he was speaking from experience. "Sometimes, you have to let it evolve on its own." The waiter, still listening quietly, marveled at how deep the conversation had already gone. What started as a casual lunch had turned into a philosophical discussion about technology, control, and responsibility. It wasn't a conversation that many people would get the chance to hear, especially from two people who had such a hand in shaping the world's digital landscape. As the meal continued, the waiter could sense that this wasn't just a friendly chat. It was the beginning of something much more significant. These two men, who had changed the way the world worked, were now talking about what they had built and the future they were trying to shape. It was a rare and powerful moment, one that would stay with the waiter long after the meal was over. The conversation between Jeff and Mark continued, the air between them growing more focused as they delved deeper into the world of technology. The waiter, standing off to the side, couldn't help but listen closely, aware that he was witnessing something extraordinary. These weren't just two businessmen talking shop. They were discussing the future of technology itself. the things that most people could only dream about. Mark shifted in his seat, his expression becoming more serious. "There's something we've been working on at Meta," he began, his voice low. "It's called Project X. It's an AI initiative that aims to create something more human-like, a form of artificial intelligence that feels real, not just programmed." He paused, looking at Jeff, waiting for a reaction. Jeff didn't seem surprised. He had been in the tech industry long enough to know that there was always a new project on the horizon, something big being developed behind closed doors. "Sounds ambitious," he said, his tone calm. "But isn't it dangerous? That advance could easily spiral out of control." Mark nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. "I know, but we believe it's the next step. AI is already a part of our lives, but it's still very limited. We want to create something that feels more natural, more integrated into the way humans think and interact." Jeff took a moment to think. "And how do you plan to make sure it doesn't get out of hand? You saw what happened with social media, right? Something meant to connect people ended up having unintended consequences." Mark smiled slightly, but it wasn't a joyful smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they're fully aware of the risks they're taking. "It's the same idea, but we're trying to learn from the past. We're building safeguards, protocols to ensure that the AI doesn't take on a life of its own. It's a delicate balance, but we believe it can be done." The waiter, standing quietly nearby, could barely breathe. The two men weren't just talking about future tech, they were shaping the future itself. Project X sounded like something straight out of a science fiction novel, and yet here they were, discussing it over lunch like it was a casual topic. Jeff leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "I get it, but I'm working on something similar. It's not exactly AI in the way you're talking about, but Blue Origin is developing a biosphere for Mars, a completely self-sustaining environment powered by advanced technology. We're aiming for something that can run on its own, without the need for constant human input. AI plays a huge role in that. The future of humanity might just depend on it." Mark's interest was piqued. "A biosphere on Mars? That's incredible. I didn't realize you were working on something that ambitious." Jeff smiled. "There's a lot happening behind the scenes, but it's not just about space exploration. It's about creating systems that can exist independently, whether on Earth or on other planets. We're all building toward the future in our own ways." As the two men continued to discuss their projects, the waiter stood there, absorbing every word. It was like being in the presence of history in the making. The future of technology was being written right before his eyes, and he couldn't help but feel like he was a tiny part of something far bigger than himself. The ideas these two men were discussing could change everything, perhaps even the course of humanity. As the conversation continued between Jeff and Mark, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted slightly. Up until now, their discussion had been focused on ambitious projects and the future of technology, but something had changed in the tone of their exchange. It wasn't obvious at first, but there was a subtle tension in the air, as if both men were testing the boundaries of their relationship in a way they hadn't before. The waiter, who had been quietly observing, could sense the change. He didn't know exactly what it was, but it felt like the conversation was taking a new turn. He stood nearby, making sure he stayed out of their way, but his curiosity grew. These were two of the most powerful men in the world, and yet now, their words seemed to carry a certain weight. Jeff, who had been sitting back in his chair, suddenly leaned forward. He picked up his glass of water, swirling it slowly before taking a sip. His eyes met Mark's, and for the first time that afternoon, there was a sharper edge to his voice. "You've built the most addictive product on Earth," Jeff said, his words calm but firm. "But at what cost?" Mark didn't flinch. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, looking at Jeff with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice neutral but laced with a hint of challenge. Jeff paused for a moment before answering. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his voice growing slightly more intense. "Social media, it's designed to keep people hooked, to keep them coming back for more, and all that time spent online. It affects their lives, their relationships. It's more than just a tool now. It's a force that controls how people think and act." Mark didn't respond immediately. He took a slow breath, collecting his thoughts. Social media has connected the world in ways that were once impossible, he said. Sure, there are challenges, but the benefits far outweigh the negatives. We're changing the way people communicate, how they share ideas, how they connect with one another. There was a brief silence as Jeff let those words hang in the air. Then, in a tone that was almost too calm, he said, "You send rockets to space while workers pee in bottles." Mark's face shifted slightly. It was a sharp jab, and it landed harder than Jeff had intended. But there was no anger in Jeff's voice, only the cold truth of his statement. The waiter, who had been listening carefully, couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. These two men weren't just exchanging ideas anymore. They were making real personal points. Mark paused for a moment, his fingers tapping the table. Then, with a quiet sigh, he leaned back in his chair, almost as if he was taking a step back from the conversation. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "we both know that it's easy to criticize. We've both faced our share of challenges, and we've both made mistakes. But at the end of the day, we're still building things that matter." The waiter noticed how the mood seemed to shift again. The sharpness of the conversation seemed to fade, replaced by a more reflective tone. It was clear that despite the jabs and the tension, both Jeff and Mark respected each other in their own way. They were two men who had built empires from the ground up, and they knew the price that came with it. They may have different approaches, but they shared a common understanding of the weight of their decisions. As the waiter quietly retreated to check on other tables, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The conversation had become more than just a lunch. It had become a meeting of minds, and he was witnessing it all unfold in real time. As the conversation between Jeff and Mark continued, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The tension from the previous exchange seemed to fade, replaced by a moment of quiet reflection. Both men had strong opinions about their respective businesses, but now they were finding some unexpected common ground. Mark, who had been listening carefully, leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "You know, I get what you're saying about social media," he said, his voice softer now. "There are times when I question the impact we've had on people's lives, but I also think about the bigger picture. We've created something that has brought people together in ways we never imagined." Jeff nodded slowly, taking a moment to digest Mark's words. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, reflecting on the weight of their words. It was clear that despite their differences, they both shared a deep understanding of the responsibility they carried. They weren't just building companies, they were shaping the future. "I think about my own company, too," Jeff said, breaking the silence. "Amazon has done a lot of good in the world. We've made shopping easier, created thousands of jobs, and brought innovation to industries. But at the same time, I can't ignore the impact it's had on small businesses, on workers, on the environment." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Jeff's honesty. "That's something I've never heard you talk about before," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Jeff shrugged. "We all have our blind spots, don't we? I'm not perfect, and neither is Amazon. But at the end of the day, I think we're all just trying to make the world a little better. We just have different ways of doing it." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I can't argue with that. I've always believed that technology has the power to change the world, but it's not always easy to control that power. It can be overwhelming sometimes." The waiter, who had been quietly standing nearby, couldn't help but listen. It was rare to hear such an open and honest conversation between two of the most powerful people in the world. Despite their differences, Jeff and Mark seemed to understand each other in a way that was deeper than business. As they continued to talk, their conversation shifted to more personal topics. They began discussing their families, the challenges of balancing work and life, and their shared love for reading. It was a side of both men that few people ever saw, men who, despite their immense wealth and power, were also human, with fears, doubts, and hopes for the future. Mark mentioned a book he had recently read, Neuromancer, a classic science fiction novel about artificial intelligence. Jeff smiled, recalling how he had read the same book years ago. "I remember being fascinated by it," Jeff said. "The idea of creating something so advanced, so self-aware. It's crazy how much of that is becoming a reality now." Mark nodded. "It's like we're living in the future, but it's happening faster than we can keep up with." The conversation was no longer just about business or technology. It was about their shared experiences, the challenges they faced, and the lessons they had learned along the way. In that moment, the waiter realized that despite their differences, Jeff and Mark had a lot more in common than most people would ever know. The lunch between Jeff and Mark had gone on for over an hour now, and the waiter, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, couldn't help but feel like he was witnessing something extraordinary. It wasn't just the conversation that captivated him. It was the way these two men, who had shaped the world in ways most people could never imagine, seemed so human. As the two continued talking, the waiter noticed how their tone had softened. They weren't the business tycoons that everyone saw in the media. Here, in this small corner of the restaurant, they were just two people discussing the future. They had been talking about their companies, yes, but the deeper, more personal side of their conversation was what truly held the waiter's attention. It was as though they were both searching for meaning beyond the numbers, beyond the profits. He stood by the bar now, pretending to clean some glasses, but his ears were fixed on their words. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have that kind of power. Not just wealth, but the ability to change the world, to set the course for the future. What would it be like to carry such responsibility? The waiter couldn't even begin to imagine. Mark had just finished telling Jeff about a recent trip he'd taken to Asia to meet with engineers who were working on a new form of virtual reality. It's incredible how quickly VR is evolving, Mark had said. The possibilities are endless. We're trying to make it more immersive, more natural, so it feels like you're actually there. Jeff, who had been quiet for a moment, looked thoughtful. VR is fascinating, but there's always that question, isn't there? About how real is too real. We've seen what happens when people get too caught up in the digital world. Mark nodded. I think that's the challenge we're all facing. How do we create technology that enhances life without taking away from it? How do we make sure we're still connected to what's real? The waiter couldn't help but be struck by how self-aware they both were. It was easy to forget, in all the headlines and news stories, that these were people just like everyone else, struggling with the same questions and doubts. They weren't just innovators, they were human too. As the conversation went on, the waiter found himself reflecting on his own life. He wasn't building rockets or revolutionizing social media, but he, too, had his own dreams and challenges. Maybe he wasn't changing the world in the way Jeff and Mark were, but perhaps he was still making a difference in his own way. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures, but about small moments, like this one, where he could quietly witness something significant unfolding before him. Eventually, the lunch began to wind down. Mark and Jeff were no longer discussing the future of technology. They had moved on to lighter topics, talking about their favorite books, the challenges of balancing work with family life, and even a few personal anecdotes. There was laughter now, a reminder that despite everything, they were still just two people, trying to navigate the same complex world. The waiter smiled to himself as he quietly cleared their plates. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Today, he had witnessed something rare. Two men who had changed the world, taking a moment to reflect on it all. And for a brief time, the waiter had been part of that conversation. As the lunch came to an end, the waiter couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Jeff and Mark, who had seemed so different when they first sat down, had found common ground in the most unexpected ways. What started as a conversation about business had transformed into something far more profound. The two of them had spoken openly about their fears, their doubts, and their hopes for the future. They were no longer just tech giants. They were two people grappling with the immense impact of their work on the world. Mark stood up first, stretching slightly. Well, I think we've covered a lot, he said with a smile, his tone lighter than it had been earlier. He picked up his coat and slung it over his arm. This was good. We should do it again sometime. Jeff nodded, standing up as well. Agreed, he said, offering a handshake. It's not often I get a chance to have a conversation like this. The waiter stepped forward to clear the table, carefully collecting the dishes. As he did, he overheard the final part of their conversation. You know, Jeff said, I think we've both made some mistakes along the way, but the important thing is learning from them, right? Mark smiled, his voice thoughtful. Exactly. The key is to keep moving forward, even when it's hard. There was something about that exchange that stuck with the waiter. It wasn't just about technology or business. It was about life itself. Both of these men had built massive empires, but they were still trying to figure things out, just like everyone else. They weren't perfect, and they didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to learn and grow. That in itself was something rare to witness. As they both left the table, Jeff and Mark exchanged a few more words, then walked toward the exit. The waiter watched them go, still processing everything he had just witnessed. He felt a sense of gratitude for being part of such a rare moment, one that was probably seen by very few people in the world. Once the door closed behind them, the restaurant seemed to return to normal. But for the waiter, the experience lingered. He couldn't help but wonder if he, too, could make a difference in his own life, in his own way. He didn't need to be a billionaire or a tech mogul to have an impact. Sometimes it was the small moments, the conversations, and the lessons that shaped the future. As the restaurant slowly filled with the sounds of other customers, the waiter stood at the counter for a moment, lost in thought. What he had just witnessed was a reminder that no matter who you were or where you came from, everyone had their own battles, their own journeys. And sometimes the most meaningful conversations were the ones that didn't revolve around business deals or success, but about the deeper questions of life, technology, and the world they were all trying to build together.